Well, hello, Happy New Year and good evening, and welcome to this first question and answer part of the Geography for Schools lecture series here at Royal Holloway. It's lovely to be back and to join you, and tonight to welcome Dr. Oli Mould, who last week gave a fantastic lecture on gentrification. And tonight we get the opportunity to ask Oli some of the questions that you have been asking this week or might choose to ask over the next half hour. I've got plenty of questions up my sleeve, certainly. Oli, good evening. How are you doing?
I'm well, yes. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. It's really good to see you, and thanks so much for giving that lecture last week. We've had loads of people viewing it over the past week, and more than that, we've had questions coming in as well. So that's been really exciting. It's been very widely shared. So I think it's one of those lectures that obviously fits really neatly with the A-level and probably GCSE programs. So it's making a few waves, which is wonderful to see. Thanks for giving us your time this evening as well. Towards the end of the lecture, I'm also going to just be talking about the other lectures and Q&As that we have coming up over this term. So I'll bring that information up and show that to you. And just as a reminder, every one of the lectures and Q&As that we have as part of this Geography for Schools lecture series is accompanied with teaching resources and things that you can download to help you embed this kind of material into the classroom environment. So what we want to do is to make this as helpful for you as possible and to allow you to use these materials in ways that can help transform the way that teachers teach and that students learn. And if anyone has any ideas for how we can do that better or differently, please let us know. We are here to listen and to learn and to respond. And if anyone has got any particular requests for new topics that we might cover as a department and as a set of lecturers, again, let us know, because we'd be delighted to hear the things that you need help with. Okay, Oli, what I always ask people to do at the start of this session is just to give a bit of a recap of the lecture that we had given the week before, just so that people can remind themselves of the big topics that were being discussed. So clearly we're talking about gentrification here, but I'm going to pass it over to you for just a couple of minutes of a reprise on last week's subject matter.
Thank you, Al. I mean, it's interesting that you say that there's been some interest in the term and the videos. Gentrification is a term that we hear bandied around so often. I mean, I think I heard it in EastEnders recently, and I think it's even in a Pixar film, I believe. They critique it in, I think it's Stalks, so it is mentioned. So clearly it's one of those terms.
Yet seen.
Well, it's not a very good one from what I recall, but it's they do talk about gentrification. So it's clearly a topic which has punctured into the mainstream, let's say, and people understand or heard it, perhaps without really understanding the nuances of it, which is what I really tried to get across in the video, essentially, in the lecture, was that gentrification is something which has a very specific history. It's a term which was invented or coined around 1964 by a woman called Ruth Glass, who was a sociologist, an urban sociologist looking at London specifically. And she termed gentrification when she witnessed middle-class people, middle-class residents of London going into and buying up properties in perhaps working-class areas or areas of high ethnic minorities. And they were buying up these houses, doing them up and selling them on to turn a profit. And it was largely middle-class people doing this to working-class environments. And so she used the term gentrification in the same way that she sort of aligning it with the landed gentry, which back in the centuries past were commandeering the land from the peasants, the rural peasantry. So she aligned it with that idea of the landed gentry, so it came up with the term gentrification. So ultimately, it's about class. So what I was trying to get across is that gentrification has its roots, has its analytical roots in the concept of class, working class, middle class, upper class, those kinds of sociological ideas. But in the sort of, the 60, 70 years since, clearly there's been a lot of work. The world has changed massively, and it's taken on lots of different kinds of analytical characteristics. One of the main ones I talk about is this idea of the rent gap. It was an idea that came about through the work of Neil Smith, who was a Scottish geographer based out in New York. And there's lots of different ways to understand it, but really at its heart, the rent gap is the sort of, it's almost the visible gap if you like, between what a piece of land is worth as it currently is, say a brownfield site in a city, or a dilapidated shop, or even a council estate, and what it could be worth if it's built upon to the higher specification, to a higher specification. So the classic example is perhaps a dilapidated shop on a high street. The rent gap is such that if it was developed into a boutique shop that fitted with the rest of the surrounding high street, you could gain quite a lot of money through rent, through business rents, and so on. So you can spot these rent gaps all over the city if you look hard enough. So the rent gap is an idea which really gets to the heart of how we can kind of analyse gentrification, how we can actually spot it as well when we're moving around the city, because sometimes you just know, sometimes you can just tell. But what I tried to do then, excuse me, was to link it to the idea of the global city. Now, that's another term which we hear a lot around within geographical syllabus and geographical scholarship. And the global city is an idea which is born out of globalization, born out of the sort of new globalized world which emerged in the 70s and 80s through financialization, the internet and global travel. And global city is really essentially the idea that there are certain cities around the world which have become the command and control centers of that global economy. The idea being that you can't control the extent and the scope of the global economy without having a particular places and nodes in the world. And they just happen to be through historical inertia and political decisions, places like London, but even not just the city of London, the actual specific parts of it, like Canary Wharf, Wall Street in New York, and Marunouchi in Tokyo. Those are the three places which Saskia Sassan outlines in her book. And anyway, so there's a lot of work about global cities and how lots of cities all over the world want to become a global city. There's all these league tables and rankings and everything else that have made cities want to be the next big thing. And gentrification plays a massive part in how they do that. So gentrification has become a state-level enterprise insofar as that big cities like London, like New York, but also the smaller cities that fall underneath them, if you like. So perhaps Birmingham in relation to London, or Boston in relation to New York. They're trying to be the next big thing. So they gentrify. They actually employ processes of gentrification to try and climb that ladder. So that's really what the lecturer is trying to do, is trying to juxtapose those two ideas which you would have heard about and learned about to see how they relate together. And then, of course, on top of that, which I didn't really go into a lot of detail, but clearly that has repercussions for people in terms of displacement, and people try to resist that as well. So that's what I was getting at in the lecture, trying to bring those two terms together.
Oli, that is brilliant. I've been busily writing down notes as you've been talking, which has been reminding me of things that I wanted to ask you about. And just as a reminder to anybody watching from home, please do ask questions in the comments box under the videos, either on Facebook or YouTube, and I can see those comments here and would be delighted to put your questions to Oli. Okay, Oli, I want to start off with some of the processes of gentrification that you were talking about, because I think there's a couple of different things that I want to talk about in the first instance. Now, first of all, that observation that Ruth Glass was making in the 1960s about the 1960s era of gentrification seemed to be about middle classes moving into particular kinds of neighborhoods, and individually or as part of growing kind of packs of middle classes kind of changing the nature of that neighborhood. Yeah, and I think we've seen that not necessarily in the 60s, but certainly a bit later in the 80s in places like Notting Hill in London, where a large, of course, Afro-Caribbean population was displaced. But I think now there's also different processes of gentrification. There's kind of corporate-led gentrification, where whole districts and neighborhoods are being transformed as part of kind of corporatized plans. Can you just maybe, have I picked that up correctly, first of all? Are we saying that there are different kind of phases of globalization that has taken place almost at slightly different scales and with slightly different understandings of what we might call agency behind them?
Yes, you have. And I think that there's lots of scholarship that tries to sort of put it in phases. They talk about the first phase of gentrification, the second phase. People talk about the circuits of capital. David Harvey, a very famous geographer, will talk about circuits of capital. how they start local, but then they kind of branch out, and then they start to incorporate, like you say, sort of more institutions like real estate companies. So there's lots of scholarship that tries to analyze this in very precise ways. Yes, you can talk about it in phases, in circuits, but essentially the outcomes are quite similar insofar as that it's usually in places where it happens in global cities, in places like New York, London, and other global cities around the world. It's often the urban poor that are at the sharp edge of this. And of course, in the 21st century, my research site is mostly in London, but you can see it in other kind of cities, particularly in the global north, insofar as that rent gap is, developers will try to find that rent gap as best they can. And if it happens to be people's homes, like council houses, or just simply houses that perhaps aren't built to the best standard possible, they suddenly become in the crosshairs, they suddenly become targeted. So yes, there are certain stages to this. And they happen sometimes they happen at the same time, almost. Sometimes you can sort of see it, and that one doesn't necessarily have to lead on to the other, but you can look at them analytically in different ways. And what I would just add quickly is that there's a famous gentrification scholar called Loretta Lees, who works up at Leicester University, and she has written very, very vehemently about this topic. And one of the most famous papers, or one of the most important interjections that she made, was in 2003, 2005, when she talked about super gentrification. And she was specifically looking at Brooklyn Heights in New York, which is a sort of now very posh, well-to-do part of Brooklyn, which butts right up against Manhattan, so you can sort of wonderful views over to Wall Street and lower Manhattan. But she was arguing back then, sort of 20 years ago or so, that it was that part of New York was being skipped. So the middle classes themselves were being priced out by massive, the very, very wealthy, the elite financial class who happened to work out in Wall Street just across the water, and they were buying up these lovely brownstone, typical New York properties. So her argument was that there was this process of super gentrification, very financialized, treating houses as assets rather than homes, and skipping out the middle class altogether. So we see a lot of that happening now. So yes, we can think about it phased, but often they work in tandem, and they work overlapping one another.
That's actually really helpful, because I think there probably is a temptation to impose a kind of phase model onto this and to try and look for a kind of logic. But I think what you're saying is that these things are actually happening together in quite a complex way all the time, and that you shouldn't necessarily think that kind of middle class led gentrification is something of the past. Absolutely, and I think don't get me. This phasing model helps us to understand it. It helps us to analyze it. And it helps us to identify it. And if your political motivations are such to resist it and to try and change that in some way. But the city, as we know, is an incredibly messy environment. The lived world is far more messy and unordered than that. And when we come to do our research projects, it's often a case of we take these themes and these processes and we overlay them on top of another, and we think, well, that's happening there, that's happening here. How are they working together? How are they counteracting one another? And what kinds of urban environments is that producing for the kinds of people that want to live there, or that do live there, or used to live there? So yes, they're useful analytically, but they are just tools. They're sort of conceptual tools that we can open up when we get into the street and use to tell the story that we're seeing. Oli, that's really, really helpful. And actually, what I think that really neatly leads on to a question that we have just received. This is a question from Claire Hatfield, Miss or Mrs. Hatfield. Hello, good evening to you. He's actually come with us with a couple of questions from her students. I don't know which school this is from, but nonetheless, Claire might let us know. So, first of all, Claire tells us that her students watched this lecture last week, which is fantastic. And thank you very much for doing that. My A-level students watched the lecture last week and have the following questions. We'll start off with the first one. This is a tricky one for you to answer. I fully recognize this, but do the positives of gentrification outweigh the negatives? What I suspect you're going to say is it's not as simple as that, but I will let you answer this question in your own way, Oli.
Cheers, Al. Thank you. Yes, I think you're right. It's not as simple as that. So I think there's two things to think about here. The first is, what do we mean when we say sort of the positive outcomes for who, for what, for where, and actually, do we consider gentrification a process that is sort of immutable in that way? My response to this question has always been, well, actually, gentrification as an analytical process includes understanding displacement. It includes understanding the outcomes of the agency of the people that are instigating the change. So be that a middle class family, be that a real estate company, or indeed national governments. You could talk, you could look at particularly in London, a lot of the places have been, a lot of the money comes from Middle Eastern companies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, that pour in lots of money. So you could argue that national governments themselves are instigators of this. So I think that we have to be careful not to sort of cleave it into, well, is it good or is it bad? I think you have to say, actually, gentrification includes the positive and the negative outcomes as part of its analytical process. I think to answer your question slightly more indirectly, is to say that actually a good outcome of gentrification, if we want to sort of call it good in terms of the best for the people that live there and for the greatest good, then my personal argument would be that actually we're not looking at gentrification, we're looking at development done really well, or we're looking at community-led development. Gentrification includes the study of the changing lives of the people that are there, which clearly have more often negative connotations than they do positive. So that's my response to that question, which I grant you is a thorny one because it has all sorts of political manifestations and includes your personal experience as well. But I would argue that we need just to sort of include the positive and the negative in our analysis of the broadest sort of idea of gentrification.
Oli, thanks so much for that. And actually, again, it sets up really nicely the second question that Claire in her class had. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Focus E15 group.
I am, yes.
Okay, I've actually just got I'm going to share the website so people at home can also see who the Focus E15 group are. But on the subject of like the benefits versus the cost of gentrification, Claire is clearly drawing our attention to a particular case study here.
Yes.
So our group, such as Focus E15 Mothers, effectively tackling the problems associated with gentrification. What's your opinion on that? And whilst you attempt an answer, I'm going to share my screen and show people the E15 group according to their website.
It's fantastic you bring them up, Claire. I'm really glad that if you are teaching and you're using their case study in your teaching, then I doff my cap, because they are an incredibly important group, actually. For those of you who are slightly maybe unaware, the Focus E15 refers to the postcode. E15 is a postcode in London, in Newham, in East London. And they were a group of single mothers who were all put up in a sort of, I'm going to use the term halfway house. That sounds rather derogatory, but it was a house for single mothers who perhaps needed help from the local council before being moved on to wherever it might be. And they found very quickly that there was a particular house and estate they were staying in was going to be demolished in lieu of the Olympics. Actually, it was back in 2012, and the legacy of the Olympics. And they very quickly garnered a great deal of support. They actually put on various artistic interventions. They put theatre performances and made artistic, and they actually got together with a number of academics, actually myself included. So there was a great deal of song and dance made about it, quite literally in some cases, and they were able to really champion the lives of the people that this particular process of gentrification was affecting. So they were able to say, look, this is an important site for us because it's giving us a place to stay, because we're at the sharp end of London's housing crisis. What's going on here is a land grab. What's going on here is essentially what they described it as just profiteering, as people just trying to make a quick buck out of the Olympics, out of the foray of the Olympics. And they're arguing that actually this is happening across London, and we need to be a little bit more considerate of the lives of the people that have been affected. So the Focus E15 mothers were a very good example, and they're still active today. They're still involved in a lot of advocacy and using their experiences. And the process is still rumbling on, but they're a very good example of how people on the ground are kind of resisting it, and just highlighting what they see as the problematic processes involved.
Oli, in your answer there, I mean, you've also brought up a really important additional point, I think. And by the way, a shout out to Claire and the students of Samworth Church Academy in Mansfield for those really fantastic questions. And it's quite clear that Claire is drawing on some really powerful case studies to help her students understand the implications of gentrification. But I mean, clearly, the London Olympics is a really example of a global sporting mega event being hosted in London that led to vast gentrification of parts of East London. And in a way, what you have there is a kind of state-led process of very purposeful redevelopment. I mean, people, when the government were bidding, I think it was under Tony Blair, or certainly Gordon Brown was involved as well. When they were bidding for the London Olympics, they talked about the potential economic transformatory effect it would have in the Lee Valley of London. So I mean, this is perhaps an example of state-led gentrification, which then led to presumably private capital being used to drive a lot of this. I mean, this is another. I mean, this draws our attention to another agent of change here, and that's both national government, but also local government as well, along with the forces of capitalism. Yes,
no, and that's right. So this is one of the the fundamental issues of that development of gentrification I've been talking about from the sort of the last 60 years or so, since Ruth Glass first coined the term. And so far as she was talking about individual families, changing houses, whereas now that's developed right the way through to, like you say, national governments, local governments, big corporate events, the IOC, the Olympic Committee, the World Cup. So there's lots of these different institutions at varying levels who are all, I was going to say in cahoots, that sounds sort of loaded, but they all work together to try and change the city, usually for the benefit of their to make their profit margins bigger for their clients, for their whoever they want their city to be like. So there's lots of tools that the national governments and big corporations will use to do that. And mega events are just one of that. The Global South in Brazil was a really good example. There's a very striking map which I like to show in my lectures, which is those favelas in Rio de Janeiro that were targeted for pacification, which is essentially quite a violent sort of slum clearance through the police and the military, and those favelas which were close to the Olympic venues, and they're almost, the Venn diagram is pretty much a circle. The favelas that were targeted were the ones that were sort of being cleared deliberately because they were very close to the Olympic venues. So they're often used, these big mega events, as like you say, they're used as vehicles and catalysts and excuses, really, to change the city to be more gentrified, to be more profitable, to be more for the middle classes, for the professional classes. So so we have to think about those agents, and they range across the scales.
One of the academics that you talked about was Saskia Sassen, whose work, of course, has been really influential, and her book on global cities is kind of definitional in a sense. But of course, she was writing at a particular period of time. From what I recall, certainly writing it in the late 80s and published in the early 90s. And she talked about particular global cities like London, New York, and Tokyo, or at least even the financial center of Tokyo. But I just wonder, if you were updating that work today, if you were to look for those levers of economic power, has there been a shift over that period of time, over the last 20, 30 years? I mean, are we talking about more Shanghai, Beijing, and potentially, well, maybe not Delhi quite so much as a controller of one of the levers of power, but certainly subject perhaps more to those levers of power?
It's a very good question, Al. And actually, this might be something you might want to look up while I'm talking. But the Loughborough University have a fantastic resource called the Globalization and World Cities Group, GAWC, GAWC, which I use quite a lot in my teaching here at Royal Holloway. I did a postdoc at Loughborough many years ago, and they're still very active. And what they do is they produce these maps called the World According to GAWC. And they essentially use a particular empirical data research project, quite statistical, and they rank cities based on this kind of connectivity. And I won't go into the methods now, but suffice to say that what they're trying to do is to measure the globality of cities, and so. And what they've done, and they produce it every sort of 3 or 4 years, and you can actually see that there are certain cities like Shanghai, like Beijing, perhaps in the traditional BRIC countries, that have become more global within the confines of their methods, which I hesitate to say that they are, that there's issues to pull them apart and everything, but there's lots of data on that website to highlight how there are cities that are sort of rising further up these league tables. Of course, the counter argument is that, well, why do we even need these league tables in the first place? These league tables are just exacerbating, inequality in the global system between global north and global south cities. And so, there's lots of, you start looking at this, you start looking at the methods, and then you can start to sort of open the door to various other forms of colonial critiques of this idea. But suffice to say, you're absolutely right. If I was updating Sassan's work 20 years, 30 years, hence blimey, 30 years.
I struggled to believe that myself. I was about to say
91 feels like a decade ago, right? No, it's it's London and New York and Tokyo, to a certain extent, are still going to maintain at the sort of top of that hierarchy because they've done so well at guarding themselves, essentially. And they represent the 3 cities across the 3 sort of mega regions of the world, like the Americas, Europe, and Asia. And maybe that Asia is sort of shifting a little bit to Shanghai, but suffice to say, in the Americas and Europe, London and, Brexit notwithstanding, London and New York still rule the roost, and they still suck up huge amounts of resources just through their gentrification processes, alongside their financialization and the growing infrastructure and everything else that they have. So they've done very, very well at maintaining their position at the top of this hierarchy. So actually, at the very top, it hasn't been a huge amount of change. It's kind of the next level down. Like I say, if we're still talking about hierarchies, which in and of themselves are quite problematic, but suffice to say, there hasn't been a huge amount of change.
That's really interesting, because of course these cities both, and as you say, the conference rooms, the boardrooms inside very particular parts of those cities, they control the levers of economic power. But of course, the cities immediately around them, but also cities around the world, then become subject to their economic power, to the decisions made in those rooms. So London and New York and others have been gentrified by finance provided from, for example, London. I've done a lot of work in Sri Lanka in the past, and I know that the capital city there, Colombo, is undergoing vast transformation, both gentrification, in other words, neighborhoods are being transformed, but also reclaiming vast territory from the sea. And most of that finance is coming from China, the Chinese state development corporations. So I guess there's a complex geography here of where finance is originating and where it's flowing. And perhaps we can also begin to recognize like developing world finance, if we still consider China to be developing world, flowing to other developing world cities, and propelling the gentrification that might be happening in some of the global south or developing world.
That's right, and it's a really key point. The global south gentrification debate is one that's really important, and a lot of scholars have been thinking about that as a critique to the Eurocentric view of gentrification. So that the history of gentrification that I just outlined in that lecture is incredibly Eurocentric, and that's, now there's a lot of imperialism with that, as you said, that a lot of that money from London, New York flowing to the global south. But now we're seeing the global south's development as well. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in cities like, particularly in Africa, where China is plowing a lot of money into, we're seeing incredibly violent forms of gentrification, very quick, very rapid, along with a lot of sort of militarized state involvement as well. So the gentrification is actually even more stark. They're creating even more divisions and more inequality through some sometimes quite sort of heavy-handed techniques. So the gentrification in the global south is an important sort of topic, and one that shouldn't just be considered a copy and paste from the global north. There are very different geographies in play in that situation.
And actually, Oli, again, that takes us brilliantly on to, I think, the last question that I certainly wanted to ask you, and that's really about resisting gentrification. Yeah. So we've talked quite a lot about the forces that cause it and provoke it, and some of the implications of it. And obviously, in terms of the Olympic part, we've talked about one example of resistance, or at least awareness building around the implications of displacement there. But what about the broader kind of politics of resistance around gentrification? Have you got any good examples that people might be able to take away with them for how gentrification has been either successfully or unsuccessfully resisted?
Well, the Focus E15 Mothers is a very good example, and so I'm glad that's being used. One which is close to my heart is the London South Bank, the skateboarders. Some of you may be familiar or not, but in 2015, there was something called the Battle for the South Bank. And those of you who've been to London will know that there's an incredibly beautiful skate park just sort of underneath the Hayward Gallery near the South Bank Centre. And for many years, it's been there. For many years, there's been a fantastic skating community. It wasn't built as a skate park. It was built as just a sort of unused space, but the skaters commandeered it back in the 70s as it's perfect for skateboarding. I skateboarded in my youth. It's beautiful, perfect. And in 2015-16, there was the South Bank wanted to get rid of it and turn it into a row of shops. But very quickly, the skateboarders got together, sort of rallied in the same way the Focus E15 to a certain extent. But they garnered support from celebrity skateboarders and all sorts to successfully rebuke this development. And funnily enough, I always say to my students, it was Boris Johnson who signed off the fine as the mayor of London. So it's perhaps the one good thing that he's done. But anyway, it's got stopped. But now what's happened actually is that they've extended the site, and actually the South Bank Centre are now working with the skateboarders about 5 or 6 years hence to create it's a bit more kind of sanitized, I'm not going to lie. It's health and safety, and perhaps it's a little bit less grungy, let's say, than it used to be. However, it is still a skate spot which caters for, quite a subcultural community, which ordinarily wouldn't have that kind of provision. There's a lot of working class kids in Lambeth and all around here. So that's a really great example of gentrification, perhaps from a cultural perspective or a retail perspective, not necessarily housing, because everyone looks to housing, but gentrification can include these sort of spaces of play and retail and kind of consumption, as well as housing. But yeah, just look around the city yourself. When next time you go into a city or even a sort of town or a sort of peri-urban environment, I'll go back to that rent gap. You just know it when you see it. You can see something that says, do you know what? That doesn't look like everywhere else. I bet that's going to be changed in the next year or so. And see it for yourself, because the moment you start to unpick it, the moment you start to sort of stop there and actually think about what you're seeing, it becomes very easy to see.
Oli, I totally agree with you. You and I don't live terribly far apart from one another, and we live fairly close to a town called Woking. And I think I saw you tweet last week that Woking is being turned into a kind of mini Manhattan.
Yes,
I mean, we've now got skyscrapers in this, in this commuter town in Surrey, which is kind of extraordinary to see. And I saw one particular aerial photograph of these vast high-rise buildings alongside a traditional Victorian terrace house. You're talking about the rent gap. You can kind of see it. You can almost just imagine that terrace house is the next thing to be chewed up in the Manhattanification of places like that. Or here where I am, I live in a town called Camberley. There's the same process happening as well. There's talk about big new developments, but of course one of the things that is causing resistance against that now is the drying up of capital, and concerns about the future of towns like this and of retail, which has traditionally been one of the things that has driven these kind of developments.
Absolutely, and I think one of the important factors here, which I haven't mentioned, is the climate crisis, because a lot of the knocking down of buildings is a very carbon intensive process, not just in the sort of in the demolition itself, but you're releasing the carbon that's already in the building itself. And so there's a big push at the moment now to reuse existing buildings as opposed to knock them down and to just build something else. Jane Jacobs, who's she was a famous activist in New York back in the 60s, and she talked about activism. Her role was incredibly important in stopping a massive highway being built through the middle of Manhattan. But Jane Jacobs, in her writing, she said very famously the best use of building is to make use of old buildings, to sort of reuse old buildings. And we're coming back to that now with the climate crisis. There's a big hoo-ha at the moment about Debenham, one of the shops on Oxford Street, they're planning, it's a 12-story building, they're just planning to knock it down and build something, almost it looks exactly the same. And everyone's like, well, what's the point? Let's just reuse buildings. And so the climate crisis is forcing us to actually think that, well, actually, maybe we should reuse these buildings as opposed to sort of completely demolishing them. But then if you reuse them, then of course you're more sensitive to what's going on in there. So it forces you a little bit to think more about, well, what are we going to disrupt by changing this? Whose lives are we going to change? What kind of businesses might move out or move in? So the climate crisis, I think, is forcing us a little bit to shift our thinking about urban development because, I think it's more carbon heavy than people like to make out.
I think that's a really fantastic and thought-provoking way to kind of begin to wrap this up. And I don't know if government planning legislation fully accounts for all of those questions yet. I don't think it forces environmental auditing of the kind that you're talking about and for the complete environmental footprint of demolition versus reuse to be fully considered. But these are clearly active political, environmental, economic discussions that need to be having. And it doesn't just apply to the big cities, which have slightly dominated what we've talked about today, but equally, market towns and frankly, almost everywhere that anybody watching this lecture may be living right now.
Absolutely, and even in places like Mansfield as well. So it's something which we're going to have to pay close attention to. And there's talking about going back to resistance and the way that feeds in. There's good examples. Another sort of mode of resistance is people residents, for example, creating alternative plans. So alternative plans to the demolition of a housing estate, for example. There's lots of good examples again in London, but all around the world really, where residents of low-income housing estates, they see a master plan, they see that they're being bought out by a big private developer who's come up with their own plans for shiny new buildings, and they turn around and say, well, actually, here's an alternative plan, which actually doesn't knock down the buildings, it's reuse, but actually it develops the area in a much more sustainable, more just, and more environmentally friendly way, which, is that gentrification? Well, it's certainly urban change. But actually, if it's done in a way which is sensitive and actually includes those different groups and the different sensitivities, then maybe it's not gentrification at all. Maybe we can call it development done well. I don't know. But suffice to say...
Participatory development.
Well, exactly. So I think it brings us back to this idea of what do we mean by gentrification at the end of the day? Does it include these people? Does it include the people that live there, the environment, the surrounding areas? If all that's included in a democratic process of change, then for my money, that is gentrification done extremely well.
Oli, I think that is the magic note to end on. Gentrification can be done well, it can be done differently, and there are examples out there where that traditional top-down model of gentrification, that mold is being broken. Oli, thanks for leaving us with that positive thought. Just hang on just 1 second, if you would, because what I want to do now is just to remind people about what we have coming up. Here is your talk here. That was your lecture last week on the 10th of January. Next week, we have Celia Martin Puertas talking about global atmospheric and ocean circulation systems. And apparently there's a fantastic tutorial that is already on the Royal Holloway Teacher Hub that uses story mapping, which you can embed in your classroom. So that sounds really exciting. And of course, there will be the week after that, there'll be a live Q&A with Celia as well. Looking slightly further ahead to the 7th of February, we've got Professor David Simon talking about sustainable cities as accessible, green, blue, and fair. And then with a Q&A the week following that. And then Adrian Palmer on patterns of glacier retreat. That's on the 28th of February, again, with a Q&A in the week following that. So we have a rich program of events and activities coming up this term. So please do keep sharing these lectures, these Q&As, and we really do hope that these materials are helpful for you and for your teaching. Oli, thank you very much again for joining us.
No worries. Thank you very much, Al.
It's been really wonderful and very thought-provoking. And to the students of Samworth Church Academy in Mansfield and to Claire Hatfield, it's been really nice that you've been able to join us as well. Oli, take care of yourself. I'll see you again soon.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.